Okay, welcome to the deep dive. This is where we grab a stack of notes and sources like these fascinating excerpts you've got looking at a key period in European history and really unpack the most important insights for you.
Right. Our mission today is to explore how traditions shifted, like really dramatically, in Western Europe. We're talking roughly the 9th to the 16th centuries.
Okay.
We'll dig into, the structure of society, the economy, and some pretty surprising changes that reshaped, well, almost everything back then.
Think of it as a shortcut, maybe. Getting to the roots of some big shifts that still influence us today.
Exactly. Cutting through the noise to get to that core understanding.
So let's unpack this. Your material kicks us off, setting the scene after the Western Roman Empire crumbled.
Precisely. By the 5th century CE, that big central Roman authority in the West, gone. What you had across Western and Central Europe were various tribal kingdoms basically carving things up.
And what's interesting in the sources is that it wasn't like a total clean slate. Those Roman institutions, the bureaucracy, ways of doing things, they were actually adapted, weren't they?
Yeah, that's a key point. These new kingdoms sort of molded them. It wasn't just chaos, it was a transformation.
Okay.
And while definitely not on the scale of, say, Byzantium in the East, your sources highlight that even by the 9th century, places like Aix, London, Rome, Siena, they weren't ghost towns.
Still hanging on.
Yeah, small but significant urban and commercial hubs. So even early on, you had some city life alongside the vast countryside.
Which is where the main story really unfolds, isn't it? Mm-hmm. From the 9th to the 11th centuries.
Yeah.
The rise of what historians call feudalism.
Exactly. What your material describes is this fundamental reorganization of society. And it's all centered on controlling land.
Okay, land is key.
It's a blend, really. Lingering Roman ideas, Germanic customs, and crucially, the church. The church was like the glue holding it together, supporting the whole structure.
And your sources stress that feudalism isn't simple. It's this incredibly complex web. Economic, legal, political, social relationships, all tangled up across the medieval era.
Right. The word itself comes from feud, the German word for a piece of land.
Okay.
And if you look at it economically, the core exchange seems, well, almost simple on the surface. Agricultural production based on the relationship between lords and peasants.
Right. Peasants worked the lord's land, plus their own bits.
Yeah. And what they gave the lord wasn't primarily money, not at first anyway.
It was labor, right?
Exactly, labor rent. A certain number of days working the lord's fields. In return, the lord theoretically provided military protection.
But it wasn't just work for protection. The lord had huge judicial control, too.
Oh, immense. Over the peasants on his land, he was basically judge and jury.
And this system, it didn't just pop up overnight.
No. Your sources trace its roots back to Roman practices, Charlemagne's time, 8th, 9th centuries, but it really cemented itself, became the established way of life across large parts of Europe by the 11th century.
Geography matters, too, I guess. You mentioned France and England.
Definitely. Roman Gaul becomes France, named after the Franks, a Germanic tribe. You have figures like Clovis, Charlemagne shaping early French history, dealing with things like Viking raids.
Right.
And then a massive moment, the Norman conquest of England. 11th century, William, Duke of Normandy, takes over.
And that links France and England.
Deeply, and often contentiously, led to centuries of pretty frequent wars between them.
Okay, so within this whole system, there's that famous idea the priests had, society divided into 3 orders.
Yes. It's a fascinating, maybe a bit too neat way medieval thinkers categorized their world, based on function, essentially.
Those who pray, those who fight, those who work.
That's it. Clergy, nobility, peasantry.
And you've got that powerful quote in there from Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, emphasizing it wasn't just practical, it was seen as like divinely ordained.
God makes distinctions among his flock, yet there is no equality among them.
Yeah, it really underscores the rigidity they aimed for.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't accidental, it was intended hierarchy. Which brings us neatly to the second order. The nobility. Absolutely central, you say, because they controlled the land.
Exactly, and that control was formalized through vassalage.
This is where it gets personal, sort of. The pyramid of loyalty. King linked to nobles, nobles linked to their own vassals or peasants?
Precisely. A noble accepts the king as his seigneur lord. It's a mutual pact. Yeah. Lord promises protection, vassal promises loyalty, military service.
And they sealed it with big ceremonies.
Oh yeah, elaborate stuff. Vows on the Bible, symbolic exchanges, maybe a charter, a staff, even a clod of earth representing the land grant.
And the perks for being a noble vassal. Wow. Absolute property control, raising your own troops, the feudal levies, running your own courts, even minting your own money.
It's incredible decentralized power, isn't it? All tied to that grant of land. The lord was effectively king in his own domain.
Ruling over everyone on his land. His own house, field, pastures, and the homes and fields of the tenant peasants.
His main house being the manor. That's the heart of the estate.
And the sources say these manors weren't just single houses. They could control whole villages, dozens, even hundreds.
That's right. And they aimed to be highly self-sufficient, growing grain, having their own blacksmiths, carpenters, stonemasons.
Women and children chipping in too, spinning, weaving.
Making candles, pressing grapes for wine, essential stuff, woodlands for hunting, pastures for livestock. Everything geared towards feeding and equipping the manor.
You'd often find a church on the estate too, and eventually a castle. You know, castles weren't really a thing in England before the Normans.
Virtually unknown, yeah. But they spread rapidly after the conquest, became these key administrative and military hubs for the new lords.
But not totally closed systems. They still needed some things from outside.
Right, essentials like salt, millstones, good quality metalware. And if a lord wanted luxuries, nice furnishings, musical instruments, ornaments that meant trade.
This constant need for military protection, these localized conflicts,
Yeah.
it leads to another key group, the knights.
Yeah, emerging from the 9th century. You needed skilled cavalry for these frequent, smaller wars. They became essential.
And they fit into the hierarchy below the big lords, linked by similar ties.
Exactly. What they got for their fighting service was a fief, a piece of land granted by their lord.
And these fiefs weren't tiny plots either. We're talking, over 1,000 acres sometimes?
Easily. Often including a house, maybe a church, other buildings, a mill, a wine press, all part of the package. Cultivated, of course, by peasants who came with the land.
And the knight's main job was?
Fighting for the lord, military service, plus paying some kind of regular fee or due. They spent their time training fencing tactics on dummies.
Could they serve more than one lord?
They could, yeah. Hold fiefs from different lords, but their primary loyalty, their main obligation, was to the lord who granted their main fief.
And there's a whole culture around them, too. Minstrels singing stories.
Right. From the 12th century in France, these traveling singers telling epic tales, maybe vaguely historical, maybe totally invented, about kings and brave knights.
Before most people could read, this was entertainment and history class, sort of.
Pretty much. Your sources even mention the minstrels' gallery, that balcony in manor halls specifically for them.
And that quote from Dune de Mayence, "If my dear lord is slain, his fate I'll share," really captures that intense, idealized loyalty, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. That knightly code, real or imagined, was powerful.
Okay, let's shift gears. The First Order, the clergy, the Catholic Church. Incredibly powerful.
Immense. Its own laws, huge landholdings given by rulers, the power to levy taxes, crucially, largely independent of the king.
Wow.
At the top, the Pope in Rome, head of the Western Church. Below him, bishops and clerics, the First Order.
And at the local level, the village church was central.
Absolutely. Most villages had one. It was the community hub, especially on Sundays for the sermon and prayers.
But not everyone could become a priest. There were restrictions.
Right. Serfs were generally barred. People with significant physical disabilities, and of course, women couldn't be priests. And men who joined the clergy couldn't marry.
Bishops, though, they sound like religious nobility.
Very much so. They controlled vast estates, lived in grand palaces. Their wealth and power mirrored the secular lords.
Where did the church get its income?
A major source was the tithe, effectively a 10% tax on whatever the peasants produced each year, levied by the church itself.
10%.
Plus, big donations, endowments from the rich, hoping to, ensure their welfare in the afterlife or for their deceased relatives.
And it's fascinating how the religious and secular worlds overlapped. Kneeling in prayer, mimicking a knight's vow.
Exactly. Clasping hands. It's the same gesture. Shows how deeply embedded these feudal customs were.
Even using the term Lord for God.
Yeah, it highlights how the lay world and the religious world shared symbols, shared a language of deference and hierarchy.
Beyond the regular parish priests and bishops, you get into monks and monasteries, a different path.
Yeah, for the particularly devout. Choosing to live apart from society in communities, abbeys, or monasteries, often in quite remote places.
Like St. Benedict's in Italy, or Cluny in France. Famous examples.
Right. Monks took vows. Stay in the abbey for life, focus on prayer, study, and manual labor. Farming was a big part of it.
Open to men and women. Monks and nuns.
Yes, though in separate communities, almost always single sex. And like priests, they took vows of celibacy, no marriage.
And these places grew huge.
Immensely, from small groups to hundreds of members, large buildings managing massive landed estates. They even ran schools, colleges, hospitals, became major institutions.
Contributing to culture, too, like Abbess Hildegard and music.
Definitely. And then later, 13th century, you get the friars, Franciscans, Dominicans. They were different. Mobile monks, traveling preachers, living on charity, not tied to one place.
Your sources give some really specific rules from the Benedictine monasteries, like permission to speak being rare.
Yes, silence was valued, humility equals obedience, no private property allowed, and that famous line, idleness is the enemy of the soul. They had to keep busy.
Aiming for self-sufficiency, too.
Very much so. Grow their own food, make their own things, ideally.
But by the 14th century, some doubts creeping in. Criticisms.
Yeah, you see it in literature. Langland's Piers Plowman contrasts the sometimes great wealth of monasteries with the simple faith ideal. And Chaucer.
Ah, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Those very human, sometimes comical portraits of monks and nuns on pilgrimage.
Exactly. It suggests maybe not everyone was living up to the strictest ideals by then.
Which brings us back to the wider church and society. It wasn't just formal stuff, was it? It blended with older folk traditions.
Absolutely. Christian beliefs mixed with, older ideas about magic, luck, things lingering from pre-Christian times.
And the church was smart, often co-opting older festivals.
Very clever. Christmas on December 25th aligns with an old Roman solar festival. Easter's timing connects to older lunar calendar spring festivals. Made the transition smoother.
Even things like walking the village boundaries continued, just renamed parish tours.
Right, linking the old custom to the priest's territory.
And holy days becoming holidays. A welcome break for peasants, I bet.
Definitely. Supposedly for prayer, but often turned into days for fun, feasting, a necessary release from all that labor.
Pilgrimage, too. A big part of medieval life.
Hugely important. People undertook long, sometimes dangerous journeys to visit shrines of saints or important churches.
Okay, let's get to the foundation of the whole pyramid. The vast majority. The third order, the peasants. You split them into free and unfree.
That's the key distinction. Free peasants and serfs.
So free peasants. They were tenants.
Yeah.
Rented land from the Lord.
Essentially, yes. They held land from the Lord but didn't own it outright. They owed military service maybe 40 days a year, and crucially, that labor rent.
Working the Lord's private land, the domain.
Right. Usually 3 or more days a week, unpaid, plus other tasks. Digging ditches, gathering firewood, fixing fences, repairing roads, whatever the Lord needed.
Women and children, too.
Oh yeah, spinning thread, weaving cloth, making candles, helping at the winepress for the Lord's use. And free peasants could be subject to taxes like the taille, a direct tax the king might impose, which clergy and nobles usually got out of.
Okay, then the serfs. The unfree. What was their situation?
Much tougher. They cultivated land that was strictly the Lord's. They didn't own it at all. A huge chunk of whatever they grew went straight to the Lord.
And they worked almost entirely on his land.
Yes, exclusively. Received no wages. And they were bound to the land. Couldn't leave without the Lord's permission.
He controlled everything. Even basic services.
Pretty much. He usually owned the only mill for grinding grain, the only oven for baking bread, the only wine press. Serfs had to use his facilities and pay a fee for it.
Even getting married required his say-so.
Often, yes. The Lord could decide who a serf married, or at least charge a hefty fee for permission. Their lives were incredibly restricted by the Lord's will.
So it sounds rigid, hierarchical, traditional, but your sources insist it wasn't static. Things were changing it, like the environment.
Big time. Environment first. Think 5th to 10th centuries. Europe was heavily forested, which limited farmland. The climate was colder too.
Meaning?
Severe winters, short growing seasons, low crop yields, tough times. Though those forests did offer a place to hide if you ran away from your lord.
But then, around the 11th century, things warm up.
Yeah, a significant warming phase. Higher average temperatures, longer growing seasons, makes plowing easier. And crucially, the forests start to recede. More land opens up for agriculture, a major expansion. But early farming tech was pretty basic, wasn't it? Very inefficient. Wooden plows that just scratched the surface, pulled by slow oxen, hugely labor-intensive, lots of hand digging. Famines were common.
And that two-field rotation system wasn't great for the soil.
No, planting half and leaving half fallow. It just depleted the soil over time. Poor yields, malnutrition. Lords kept pushing peasants for more output, more unpaid labor.
Which led to peasants resisting.
But passively. Yeah, focusing on their own little plots, maybe hiding some produce, trying to avoid the labor services. Lots of friction over common lands, pastures, forests, which lords increasingly treated as their private property.
Okay, so then comes technology. This is a game changer. From the 11th century.
Absolutely revolutionary. First, the heavy iron-tipped plow with a mold board.
What did that do?
It could dig much deeper, actually turn the soil over properly, unlocks nutrients, drains the land better. Huge difference.
And better ways to use animals.
Massive upgrade. The shoulder harness replaced the old neck harness for horses and oxen. Much more efficient pulling power. And iron horseshoes stopped their hooves rotting, kept them working longer.
Plus more use of wind and water power. Mills.
Yeah, popping up everywhere for grinding corn, pressing grapes, harnessing natural power.
But the really big agricultural innovation was the three-field system.
That was the breakthrough in land use. Divide your arable land into 3.
How did that work?
Plant one field in autumn with, say, wheat or rye. Plant a second in spring with peas, beans, oats, barley. Leave the third fallow empty to recover. And rotate each year.
And the impact was immediate.
Dramatic. Your sources say food production basically doubled almost overnight.
Wow.
Huge benefits. Better diet, more protein from peas and beans. More oats and barley meant better fodder for animals. And the surprising thing,
Go on.
peasants could actually produce more food from less land.
Less land. How?
Because it was so much more productive.
Yeah.
So average farm sizes actually shrank by the 13th century, maybe down to 20 or 30 acres from over 100. Smaller farms, easier to manage, less labor needed.
Which freed up peasant time for other things.
Exactly. And who drove this? Lords paid for the expensive mills, sure, but your sources say peasants were key too, clearing new land, adopting the three-field system, setting up village forges for cheap tools and repairs, real bottom-up innovation too.
And all this extra food, it fuels the next big change. Population growth, trade, towns.
Precisely. More food supports more people. The population booms between 1,000 and 1,300. From maybe 42 million to 73 million in Europe.
That's huge.
People lived longer too, maybe 10 years longer on average by the 13th century.
Better nutrition.
In towns. They start coming back.
Revival from the 11th century. Many had been pretty deserted since Roman times. But now you have surplus food needing markets and growing demand for trade goods, tools, things not made on every manor.
Where did they spring up?
Some grew around existing centers fairs, market crossroads. They developed a town square, a church, shops, roads. Others grew up near castles, bishops' palaces, big churches, protective centers.
And towns offered something radical. Freedom.
That was the big draw, besides paid work. Freedom from the lord's direct control. That famous saying, town air makes free.
Leading.
If a serf ran away and managed to live in a town undiscovered for a year and a day, they were legally considered free. A huge incentive.
So towns filled up with who?
A real mix. Free peasants seeking new opportunities, escaped serfs providing unskilled labor, shopkeepers, merchants. Later, as towns got bigger, you needed specialists, bankers, lawyers. The biggest towns might hit 30,000 people.
Almost like a fourth order emerging. Outside the old three.
You could definitely see it that way. A whole new social and economic force.
And town life had its own organization.
Yeah.
Guilds.
Yes, guilds were crucial. Associations for each craft or industry, bakers, weavers, goldsmiths. They controlled quality, prices, sales. The guild hall was the town's civic center. Plus you had town guards, musicians, innkeepers, a whole urban ecosystem, trade expanding too, new routes, dramatically from the 11th century, routes opening to West Asia. Scandinavian and English traders were very active, commerce and crafts booming in France by the 12th century. Craftsmen started settling in towns instead of wandering.
And the merchants in these towns, they got powerful.
Seriously rich and powerful. Started to rival the traditional landowning nobility in wealth and influence, a major shift. And this new town wealth, it shows up in stone.
Cathedrals.
Exactly. Rich merchants often made huge donations to churches. This fueled the building of those massive stone cathedrals, especially in France, starting around the 12th century.
And building them wasn't just monks and bishops.
No, it was a massive community effort. Took decades, sometimes centuries. Different groups contributed labor, materials, money, became a real focal point for the town or region.
So the areas around cathedrals grew, became pilgrimage sites.
Yes, they became centers of population, magnets for pilgrims, which spurred the growth of small towns around them.
And the design itself was clever. Acoustics, bells,
Brilliant design, not just awe-inspiring, but practical. Acoustics design so the priest's voice and the choir carried. Bells could be heard for miles, marking time and calling people. And the stained glass.
The windows, more than just pretty.
Oh, yeah. Incredible light effects, yes, but there were like giant picture books telling Bible stories to people who couldn't read. Educational tools.
That quote from Abbot Sugar about the windows at St. Denis.
Mm.
It shows how much they valued them, doesn't it? Both art and meaning.
Absolutely. The care, the expense, it shows their deep significance.
Okay, so we've had this period of growth, expansion, innovation, towns rising, transforming the old system. But then, disaster strikes. The 14th century crisis.
Yeah, the expansion slows dramatically, then reverses, hits a wall in the early 14th century, driven by three main factors your sources highlight.
Factor 1, the environment bites back.
Exactly. That warm period ends. You get bitterly cold summers in Northern Europe, late 13th century. Shorter growing seasons again. Farming on hills gets really hard. Storms, floods, damage farms. Less food, less tax income.
And the land itself was tired out.
Yeah, all that intensive plowing during the expansion. Even with the three-field system, without proper conservation, the soil got exhausted. Pastures shrink, fewer cattle.
And population had grown so much.
It outstripped the resources. The result, famine. Severe famines, 1315, 1317, then huge numbers of cattle dying off in the 1320s. It was a brutal correction.
Factor 2, money problems.
Economic contraction. A real shortage of metal, money, silver, mainly. Key mines in Austria and Serbia weren't producing as much.
So governments
Tried to stretch it. Reduce the silver content in coins, mixed in cheaper metals. Debasement. Leads to inflation, instability, lack of confidence.
And factor 3, the big one, the Black Death.
Killer blow. Arrives 1347, 1350, comes primarily on ships carrying goods and rats carrying fleas with the bubonic plague infection.
And Western Europe hadn't really faced anything like it before.
Relatively isolated from major plagues, yeah. So it hit incredibly hard. The death rates are just mind-boggling. Your sources estimate 20% mortality overall, but up to 40% in some badly hit areas.
That description from Boccaccio. Horrific, the sheer scale of death.
Yeah, bodies piling up. Cities, being dense and trade hubs, were devastated. Enclosed communities too, monasteries, convents, sometimes only a handful survived.
Hit the vulnerable hardest. Infants, elderly.
Yes. And it wasn't just one wave. It came back. Outbreaks in the 1360s, 1370s kept hammering the population.
So Europe's population just plummets.
From that peak of maybe 73 million around 1300 down to just 45 million by 1400. A staggering loss.
The consequences must have been immense. Social dislocation.
Huge. The most immediate impact of losing, a third or more of the population. A massive labor shortage.
Suddenly not enough people to work the fields and do the crafts in town.
Exactly. An imbalance. And basic economics kicks in. Fewer buyers means agricultural prices drop, but the price of labor
Skyrockets. High demand.
Absolutely. Especially farm labor. Your sources mention wages in England jumping 250% after the Black Death. Surviving workers were in a strong position, could demand much higher wages.
Which creates a huge problem for the lords, right? Their whole system was based on cheap labor and selling surplus grain.
Their income got squeezed from both ends. Low prices for their produce, high wages for labor. So what did they try to do?
Turn back the clock. Go back to the old ways.
They tried to ditch the money contracts that had become more common and force peasants back into those old strict labor services, compulsory unpaid work.
Yeah, peasants.
Yes.
Accepted it.
No way. They fought back, violently, often. Especially the better off peasants, the ones who had gained more from the earlier expansion and the shift to a money economy. They weren't giving those gains up.
Your sources list major revolts. Flanders, France, England.
Yeah, 1323 in Flanders, the Jacquerie in France, 1358, the Peasants' Revolt in England, 1381. Big uprising.
Really successful.
Well, they were brutally crushed by the nobility. But, and this is the crucial insight, the intensity of the resistance, especially where the economy was most advanced, basically stopped the lords from fully reimposing the old feudal system.
So even though the revolts failed militarily,
they kind of succeeded strategically. The money economy was just too established by then to simply roll back. Peasants ensured the worst of the old feudal burdens couldn't just be brought back wholesale.
Okay, so massive social and economic upheaval.
Yeah.
At the same time, politics is changing too. The rise of new monarchs in the 15th, 16th century.
Aerial developments, yeah. Kings like Louis VII in France, Maximilian in Austria, Henry VII in England, Isabel and Ferdinand in Spain. They're actively consolidating power. strengthening their military muscle, their financial control, moving towards more centralized, sometimes absolutist rule, building standing armies, permanent bureaucracies, national tax systems. This is also when Spain and Portugal kick off overseas expansion.
What allowed them to do this? Why then?
The conditions were right. Those social changes in the 12th and 13th centuries had already weakened the old feudal ties. Then the crisis of the 14th century creates more disruption, allowing kings to step into the power vacuum, increase their control.
Militarily, they ditch the old feudal levies.
Increasingly, yes. They fund professional infantry loyal to the king, equipped with new tech like guns, siege artillery. The old aristocratic castles couldn't hold out against royal cannons. Noble resistance crumbled.
And money.
Taxes.
Key. Increased regular taxation gave them the revenue for these armies, for defending borders, for putting down internal resistance.
Did the nobles just accept this?
Not always.
Yeah.
There was resistance, usually centered on taxation.
Yeah.
Your sources mention rebellions in England, ongoing struggles in France between the king and powerful regional nobles.
But ultimately, the kings won out.
Generally, yes.
Yeah.
And the surprising thing is how the nobility adapted. They shifted from being opponents to being, well, key players within the new royal system.
So it's sometimes called modified feudalism. Right, because the same class, the lords, still dominated society. But now their route to power was less about independent land control and more about getting positions in the king's administration, gaining favor at the royal court. Patronage.
The king isn't just the top of a loyalty pyramid anymore.
He's the center of a complex court society, a network of patrons and clients. Keeping nobles cooperative required doling out favors, positions, pensions, which all required money.
And this opens the door for non-nobles, merchants, bankers.
Exactly. They had the money the kings needed, especially to pay for soldiers. So they lent to kings, gained access to the court, influence. Money starts buying access to power in a new way, integrating non-feudal elements into the state.
And these political shifts set France and England on different paths.
Very different trajectories, yeah, shaping their modern governments.
How so?
In France, the Estates General, that assembly of the three orders, met in 1614, then the kings just stopped calling it. Not again until 1789, on the eve of the Revolution. French kings basically sidelined any power-sharing body,
Leading towards.
ultimately contributing to France's path towards revolution and a republican form of government.
Whereas England?
Their equivalent, Parliament, evolving from the old Great Council, became much more embedded, especially the idea that the king needed Parliament's consent for taxes.
House of Lords, House of Commons.
Right. When Charles I tried to rule without Parliament for 11 years, it led straight to civil war, his execution, a brief republic. When the monarchy was restored, it was understood. Parliament had to be called regularly.
So England ends up with a monarchy, but one working with Parliament.
A constitutional monarchy, essentially. A very different outcome from France's eventual republicanism, both stemming from how they navigated these changes after the 17th century.
So what an incredible journey we've tracked through your sources, from this decentralized world of lords, vassals, peasants, all tied by personal loyalty and land.
Right, through huge environmental shifts, game-changing technology and farming, the devastating crisis of famine and plague, social revolts.
All leading to the rise of these powerful, centralized monarchies.
And what's really striking, I think, is how interconnected it all was. You can't separate the climate from the tech from the population growth, the growth from the towns from the crisis from the social unrest, the unrest from the political changes.
It's all tangled together, one thing constantly influencing the next.
Exactly. It wasn't just history happening to people. It was people reacting, resisting, adapting, innovating, creating new ways to organize themselves, new forms of government out of these pressures and opportunities.
It really makes you think. As we navigate our own times with rapid tech change, big economic shifts, potential environmental crises.
What lessons can we draw from this long view of how societies fundamentally change, how power shifts, how people cope with massive disruption? What are the deep forces shaping how we live together now?
Definitely something to mull over as you go about your day.